Greetings out there, movie fans. Me, Nick Cicada, coming in hot with yet another spicy film analysis for you. It's been a while since I did one of these, just a straightforward, back to basics, fresh off the wall, brain thought rattling type movie analysis and breakdown. I figure I want to cover some themes in a movie that, despite getting a lot of talk and hype online, isn't really dissected on a philosophical level. That being David Fincher's 1995 film Se7en, starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, that said, let's get to it. Today I'm talking Se7en, I'm talking the city of Seven, and I'm talking about civic homogeneity. So we're going to draw it all together in a nice little bow. One could say we're going to put all these themes and pack them up into a nice little box. Then we're going to open the box, and Brad Pitt's going to be like, "What's in the box?" And we're going to be like, "An exciting film analysis, Brad. Here you go." One of the most interesting aspects of Se7en is the fact that its city is completely nameless. It's an anonymous city, and it could be any city. And obviously this has been noted by like every single article that's been put out about it. But oddly enough, people who point out that the city is anonymous don't really tend to figure out what kind of thematic significance that could play, because obviously if David Fincher goes to the trouble of blurring or obscuring every noticeable landmark, every possible license plate or street sign that could possibly give away what city Se7en is set in, obviously this must tie in somehow thematically to what Se7en is trying to say. Se7en is known for being a shocking, explicit, gory movie, but I don't really find the shocking or explicit scenes all that interesting compared to the straightforward dialogue scenes between Gwyneth Paltrow and Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, mainly because they're such fantastic actors that the film never gets boring. So I find the dinner scene and the scene where Gwyneth Paltrow talks to Morgan Freeman in the diner, and especially the scene at the library, where it's just kind of a breath of fresh air, a lot more interesting than the scenes where they're investigating the crimes and coming across all the cadavers. That's odd, because whenever people talk about Se7en, they mainly just talk about the ending. And I think that's a shame, because over its 2-hour runtime, Se7en has a lot to say philosophically about modernity, about the role of faith, about the role of law enforcement. I mean, this is a deep movie. It's got a lot going for it beyond, Kevin Spacey's sort of generic villain monologue. I don't even really think Kevin Spacey is the most interesting character. I think hands down Brad Pitt's performance is the most interesting, the most nuanced. It's a career highlight for him. Obviously, to get this right out of the way at the beginning, it should be said that there are a lot of people who don't like watching Kevin Spacey movies now, because obviously he's a total scumbag and a piece of shit. But I would argue that, in particular, two Kevin Spacey films, those being this, Se7en, and The Usual Suspects, are interesting because Kevin Spacey is basically playing who he is in real life. And it says something that he's drawn to these roles that depict kind of a genius intellect maniac who's able to outsmart everyone and prove himself right, such as Kaiser Soze or John Doe. There's a very specific type of character, and I find it a bizarre coincidence that Kevin Spacey played two of these characters within such a short period of time. But I would argue that if you don't watch Se7en or The Usual Suspects just because Kevin Spacey is in them, you are missing out on some fantastic movies that are really well made. And also, they're more interesting now in hindsight that we know all about Kevin Spacey and what a deplorable piece of shit he is, because this adds a new metatextual layer to it. And if you disagree and you think that you just shouldn't watch movies with controversial people in them, then, that's fine. You don't have to watch Se7en. Go watch the new fucking Fallout show or whatever. But for everyone who's left, let's talk Se7en. As I said, one of the most interesting parts of the city in Seven is that every single detail is scrubbed from it. The police badges that the cops wear just say Metropolitan Police Department. The cabs in the movie are all decked out just saying Metro Cab and then Metropolitan Department of Transportation, which is so generic. It doesn't say New York Department of Transportation. It doesn't say Philadelphia Department of Transportation. Most people place the movie as occurring in New York or Philadelphia. I'd argue Philadelphia is probably a more likely candidate, considering that Philadelphia is also the purported location of Eraserhead, and given what goes on in Eraserhead, it feels like the same sort of city that Seven would be set in. Then again, I don't know. I've never been to Philadelphia. But regardless, it's amazing how well David Fincher is able to take shots that are filmed in Los Angeles, a West Coast city, and frame them so that they look like an East Coast city. The first thing you notice about Seven City is that it's very dark and gray and dismal and just an all-around hellhole. And it's one of the most unique locations in cinema. And it's a great example of how you can take a really boring place like Los Angeles. I've said this before, I don't like movies set in Los Angeles, filmed in Los Angeles. But I do think it's amazing what David Fincher is able to do to take these very bland shots that would be bland if a director as talented as him wasn't at the helm, and turn them into this rain-soaked hellhole. There are two conflicting accounts I've found. One says that there are a lot of rain machines in the movie, and the other, which is the Wikipedia article, says that it just happened to be raining a lot in Los Angeles at the time, which I find sort of unlikely, and David Fincher could have just said that as kind of a puff piece, like, oh, it's real rain. Obviously, you wouldn't want to admit to having to haul in a bunch of rain machines, but there are a lot of articles that say that rain machines are used for certain cuts and stuff, and I wouldn't put that past the crew necessarily, but it would be a lot of effort just to get some rain, because there's plenty of shots that don't have rain, but then there are a lot that do. So I find it more likely that there probably just was incidental rain and they decided to shoot in the rain. That was definitely the right choice. It adds a lot more weight, especially to the chase scene. Anyway, point being, Seven doesn't feel like a film set in Los Angeles. But then again, its city is so nondescript and generic that it doesn't really seem like New York or Philadelphia either. It could be any city, and I love that about it. Because Seven's setting is homogeneous. It's scrubbed of all detail. It's robbed of an identity, because to afford it an identity would be to give it dignity and history. And that's something that the city can't have, because the city is an abstract representation of modernity and the ways in which modernity presses down against people and causes them to do abhorrent things to each other and to be unpleasant, which is a major theme, obviously, of Seven. It is about an unpleasant world full of unpleasant people. And I just find that fascinating, because obviously fictional cities have been a part of horror literature for a long, long time. Take Corsica from The King in Yellow, for instance. That's a great example of a fictional city that the author just made up and is meant to represent some abstract idea. Obviously, a more well-known example would be Gotham City or Metropolis from DC, or like that. But what I find fascinating about Seven, and there aren't too many other movies that do this well, Dark City would be one. I should make a video about Dark City sometime, definitely. But the fascinating and very unique thing about Seven that very few other movies do is that they're able to capture a generic American feeling, which is difficult because America is a big place and has a lot of diverse places and accents and all kinds of regional shit. But Seven is able to blur the background and obscure so many streets and businesses and shit that it barely even feels like a city. You barely even get any glimpses of anything in this place. So it could really be anywhere within the contiguous 48 states. Probably not in Alaska or Hawaii, but it's just fascinating how generic, bland, unremarkable David Fincher is able to make the city in Seven. It is fantastic. I think not only, again, the ending should be praised, that's kind of just the icing on top of this fantastic cake. what's really remarkable about Seven is the set, the city. There is only one point that I could spot where David Fincher screwed up in obscuring the filming location, and that's during the chase scene when Somerset emerges out of the apartment building that John Doe has been living in. And it's called the Chester Williams Building, and the address is right in front. And it's an actual apartment building in Los Angeles, and there's still Google results for it. It's still open to this day. That's the only example I could find of any recognizable landmark in the film, aside from obviously the fictitious props in newspapers and fake news reports and cabs, and like everything else is scrubbed to give this really generic, homogeneous appearance. And then this one frame with just the name of this apartment building kind of ruins that. And I'm not sure if there's any significance to it. If there is, let me know down in the comments, but from everything I can tell, it's just incidental. That's a real shame, but you know, no director is perfect. Kubrick isn't, David Fincher isn't. David Fincher is a great director. I mean, he should get as much praise as Kubrick, given just the level of detail that's obviously put into Seven. It's a very set-conscious type of film. But I do feel that even the best directors make mistakes sometimes, so I have to assume that this Chester Williams building thing is just kind of either, you know, he didn't really care or it wasn't noticed. But that is just really the only blemish on an otherwise, like, perfect-looking movie. Now, if we are to take John Doe at face value, as he says during the car ride out during the end, then he is nobody, his life is insignificant, meaningless, and he's really not any kind of great figure. And I think that line was added into the movie on purpose, obviously. All lines are in the movie on purpose. Every single piece of dialogue is significant, as I would expect from any good movie. But I think this line is really significant in that it denotes that John Doe is not necessarily even the real antagonist of the film. I believe that the really stunning thing about Seven is that the city itself is a character. The city, society, modernity, whatever you want to call it, we live in a society, is the fourth character alongside the main three. It's the silent antagonist. It's the creeping, gnawing dread. It's imbued with so much character, so much life. It feels like such a real place that you just can't quite put your finger on, that it in and of itself is kind of the cause of the events of the film. Obviously, if there wasn't this massive urban sprawl, this decaying hellhole that's full of corruption and vice and just horrible things, the events of the movie would not take place. The city is literally never spoken of in positive terms during the entire film. It is depicted as a negative place where nobody should want to live or exist. Brad Pitt's character's wife, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, talks about it like it's a hellscape. Brad Pitt's character talks about like it's a hellscape. Morgan Freeman's character talks about like it's a hellscape. It's described as like a desert island in the metaphor that Somerset uses. It is described as extremely alienating, and every day that goes by you have to either develop apathy or you have to confront it. And those are really the only two available options, which are exemplified by Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's characters, who obviously have very different views on how to approach modern society and living in the modern world with such rampant decay and obvious systemic problems. I think this contrast is best exemplified in the scene where they're at the bar and they're talking about whether or not these kinds of things are committed by insane people or whether they're committed by everyday people. Obviously, Brad Pitt's character is of the opinion that these sorts of acts are only committed by crazy people because he's a character from outside the city, now in the city. He was external and now he's internal, whereas Somerset, Morgan Freeman's character, is much the opposite. He is a character who has lived in the city for so long that everything in it has become routine to him. He knows what to expect. He's been around the block, and he's planning to leave. And this is a fascinating contrast that's explored really well within the film. As much as I like movies like 48 Hours with Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy and whatever, and I like the ending where they make up and they're good buds, I think that that's kind of unrealistic. I do like Se7en in that it's kind of the anti-buddy cop movie. These two guys don't really like each other. They never really have anything going on together. They're not that great of friends. They argue constantly. I think that's a much more realistic, accurate depiction of how it must be to constantly investigate these gruesome crime scenes. And you can tell that Somerset, although he puts up a good front, his mind is broken from having to deal with all this shit day in and day out. He really, really wants to leave because it is so insipid. This is a fantastic contrast. I feel like the chemistry and dynamic between Pitt and Freeman is not brought up nearly enough in discussions of Se7en. It's one of the absolute highlights of the film. Obviously, the overarching presence of the city can even be felt in stuff like the dinner scene. Brad Pitt and Gwyneth Paltrow's character's house looks, for all intents and purposes, like a pretty classy place, but then the subway comes booming in while they're trying to eat, and this is a great representation of how they can't distance themselves from it as much as they might try with their nice fancy furniture and record player and modern decor. They can't avoid the city. The city is overarching, it's inescapable, it's claustrophobic, and the subway is going to come in and fucking mess their shit up every half an hour or so. It's like that scene in the Blues Brothers, you know, and that place is like obviously a cramped squat, but here you've got Brad Pitt and Gwyneth Paltrow, and they're in this like pretty luxurious looking pad, you know, and Morgan Freeman even like compliments it, and it's like, wow, this is a nice spot. But there's a subway that goes by every freaking half an hour and jostles everything around and just fucks everyone's mind up. It's like Chinese water torture. So we can accept then that Brad Pitt's approach, where he believes that people are just crazy and John Doe is just crazy and all the people he killed are just like evil and crazy, and he wants to distance himself as much as possible from all of that and declare himself a sane, rational person. And on the other hand, Somerset is of the opinion that it's predictable and that people can fall into these sorts of patterns and that this is a part of the modern world that must be accepted. And ultimately, when Brad Pitt kills Kevin Spacey at the end and shoots him in the head, he is proving Somerset's point, kind of. He's kind of proving that people can be tempted into doing the wrong thing. If there's enough incentive, they will do some morally reprehensible or ethically objectionable thing and just go for it. You know, I don't think shooting John Doe is ethically objectionable, but as we were shown earlier in the film, Morgan Freeman's character is such a by-the-books type guy that he won't even let Brad Pitt break into Kevin Spacey's apartment. He's like, we got to do it by the books. We don't have a warrant. We got to get a warrant. And Brad Pitt's like, fuck this. I'm going to kick the door down. We're going to go in here. We're going to collect all this evidence. So right off the bat, we're informed that Somerset likes to do things by the books, and Will's is kind of a loose cannon, and he's willing to take things up a notch, do things his own way, if necessary. That's a good bit of characterization that foreshadows the ending in a really unique and clever way, and I like that because a casual viewer wouldn't notice it. Like, these characterizations are so subtle and just kind of imbued that you wouldn't notice them if you weren't looking for them, and you absolutely couldn't predict the ending. While the ending is well known now, I can see why it's gotten a lot of acclaim as a good twist. It is a great twist and all. I can only imagine what it must have been like to see it the first time, because it is completely, like, you know, just totally fucked, but it's a darn good ending. Like I said, though, I do think it gets a bit too much praise compared to what leads up to it, the rest of the movie. It's a good movie. There's something interesting about the ending, obviously, though, which is that I believe that the communication towers, obviously the plot reason for it, which I didn't even really think of while I was watching it, but the Wikipedia article points out that John Doe takes them out there so that it'll interfere with the police communication, the helicopter, which I guess is true, it would, but that's not stated anywhere explicitly in the film. I suppose that does figure into John Doe's master plan a bit, which, ultimately is a good bit of storytelling that isn't stated explicitly. That is why they're at the communication towers. That's a good location for John Doe to consider. But I believe also that the communication towers are sort of a symbolic parallel with the city. I mean, they are these tall, dark, imposing structures in the middle of nowhere and kind of purposeless and formless. And I think that they are kind of analogous to the city in a sort of metaphorical sense. They're the city's mirror opposite. Obviously, that probably wasn't intended by David Fincher, but it is fascinating. I mean, they are really cool structures. I've been around communication towers and big antennas, and they're pretty freaking interesting. Giant structures out in the middle of nowhere. And this also kind of ties back into the city itself is for no reason, it's just in the middle of nowhere and it serves no real purpose besides driving alienation and neuroticism in the modern person. Now, obviously, one of the most interesting things being that these communication towers are out in the middle of the Californian countryside, out in the midst of the desert, whereas the movie is supposedly meant to look like somewhere on the East Coast, like Philadelphia, and obviously there aren't any deserts out there. So this doesn't make any sense. And if you actually think about them leaving this rain-soaked, dark city and going out into the sunny desert, it's a complete non sequitur. Like, these two locations would not exist within, like, driving distance of each other, certainly not within an hour. If they leave at 6 p.m. and then the shooting happens at 7:07, which is what's implied, that would be an hour and 7 minutes, and there aren't obviously any broad, sweeping, western-looking deserts within driving distance of any East Coast city. So this is an interesting, mostly incidental setting thing. I mean, I doubt David Fincher was really taking all this into account. It was probably just convenient to shoot out in the desert because they were in California. They weren't actually in New York or whatever. Then again, the movie isn't even meant to be in any particular city, and they took extra special care to ensure that it wasn't. It's fascinating nonetheless to see the contrast between the city and what's outside it, and this claustrophobic environment that the entire movie has been set in up to this point, and then you leave it and you realize that there's a whole world out there, and you just have to wonder, like, what the Se7en universe must be like. It's a fascinating look into a world that has no reason to exist, if you think about it for like more than a second. This is not our America. It is a completely manufactured, like, simulacra of America with very specific elements of American culture and being just like placed into this manufactured construct. It's honestly amazing, and I think it's comparable almost to what Kubrick did for Eyes Wide Shut, where he recreated the entirety of Greenwich Village just in like posters and shit. Like, it's that good. Except, like I said, instead of being a specific setting, Se7en's strength comes from its ambiguity. It comes from its nondescript features. The fact that it could be anywhere, and it's so bland and tepid. I believe this kind of goes to show the mundanity of the modern setting and the alienation and the neuroticism and the banality of evil, too. If we're currently going through a period of postmodern alienation, then I would say that Se7en is representative of modern alienation. It was at a point where modernism had kind of reached its peak. Mid to late 90s, I would argue, is sort of the pinnacle of that, the apex, as it were. And in Se7en, we see a world that's tearing apart at the seams, destroying itself, cannibalizing. Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's characters take different approaches to that, to surviving. But when Gwyneth Paltrow's character is like, I'm not even sure if I want to bring a child into this world, This is very interesting because you hear similar arguments today. There are people who just feel miserable about the world and their place in it. And I think Seven is a very relatable film in that regard. It's about the decay of civilization. Seven's also interesting because what John Doe says about being idolized and worshipped is kind of true. There are people who idolize Ted Bundy, there's people who idolize Ted Kaczynski, there's people who idolize Charles Manson. You can take the Brad Pitt approach or the Morgan Freeman approach, but ultimately it doesn't really matter because figures like John Doe will be idolized in a society as diseased and dysfunctional as ours. Seven holds up a dark reflection to our own being, our own state of things, in a way that few movies do. And in that regard, it's utterly fascinating. One can only imagine that in the Seven universe, which obviously wasn't explored after Seven, which is a shame, there was going to be a sequel, but I don't think it could have been anywhere near as good as Seven. And then, of course, there's the prequel comics, but they're not that good. I would say that you should probably just stick with Seven. I don't really think Seven ever really had any hope of becoming a franchise. That's a nice thought, but I don't think it would have worked out, so I'm kind of glad it petered off. One can only imagine that in some kind of sequel, or just in the aftermath of the Seven universe, John Doe probably will be the subject of a ton of exploitative, schlocky Netflix true crime documentaries that go into detail about how it was, and how Brad Pitt was, and how Morgan Freeman was. And it's really interesting to think about that because I see all these, shitty, repetitive Ted Kaczynski or Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy type documentaries that just rehash the same boring details over and over of these boring, pathetic people who do horrible, pathetic things, and obviously are just symptomatic of an environment that breaks the mind and the will to live. And the will to be a productive member of society. Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and John Doe, all these type people are symptomatic of just like societal rot, which I do find fascinating in a certain sort of way, but I do find these true crime documentaries really fucking boring. Nonetheless, it's fascinating to think that there probably is, in the Seven universe, just the same shit. You just see the same exact footage of Brad Pitt shooting John Doe from the police helicopter over and over again, and shitty recreations. That could be interesting to put in a potential Seven sequel. I know it's never going to happen, but it's just like the first thing that springs to mind is just like everyone, talking about John Doe, like, wow, man, John Doe has a point. Oh, man, John Doe, oh, damn, poor John Doe. Oh. I don't necessarily think that Brad Pitt's oversimplified view, where he just dismisses everyone as crazy because he can't cope with it, is necessarily the right approach. I do think it's much more interesting and satisfying, and I'm sure David Fincher would agree with this, to view these things on a societal type level. But at the same time, I don't really get the current true crime craze. But it's interesting because it has popped off as of late, and I just find it very annoying. I think true crime is stupid, and I think the term true crime really just goes to show that, like, actual crime, like the Maltese Falcon or whatever, that shit's gone way down in quality, or, Silence of the Lambs, Seven, whatever, great crime stories that are, like, way more engrossing. They've really gone down in frequency and quality. It's an interesting genre, crime. I mean, I don't get into it much, but it's interesting. And I don't think true crime is as interesting because obviously within fiction, you can create enigmatic, fascinating characters like John Doe, who, all things considered, just for artistic license purposes, is way more interesting than Ted Bundy or whatever, and is able to get away with his Machiavellian scheme, whereas Jeffrey Dahmer or whatever didn't really even have a Machiavellian scheme. The serial killing portrayed in Seven is so stylized and so outrageously over the top in a way that actual serial killings really aren't. It's just stab, stab, or dunk in the acid bath, but it's never I'm going to kill this person in a very specific way because of who they were or whatever. That's not really a thing, at least to my knowledge, that serial killers typically do. So I feel that the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction, it's a load of horseshit, and I've never stood by that. I think you can create way more interesting fictitious scenarios in your mind than you really can just like in real life. And that's why I think Zodiac, David Fincher's other like crime movie, which came out in the 2000s, while it is pretty to look at, and Robert Downey Jr. is great, and it's really interesting how they recreate a lot of the case. It's just not as interesting because it isn't tied up at the end. They never catch the Zodiac killer. That's kind of thematically the point of the movie. Obviously, they have to make that a theme of the movie because the movie itself has to accurately adapt the actual case where they never found the Zodiac killer, which is just kind of unsatisfying. Like if you stack it up to Seven, if you compare Zodiac and Seven, I think Seven is a better movie, hands down. Zodiac's great, like I said. It's a fine movie. It's a decent watch. I'd recommend it. But it's not as good as Seven because it's constrained by having to cope with reality, and you can't create a twist as awesome as Seven's. You can't create a villain as compelling as John Doe if you're constrained by facts, because reality, where you never catch the Zodiac killer, isn't as satisfying or as interesting or as fun as a nice self-contained, self-explanatory, thematically complex film like Seven, where the writers are given total free license to do whatever they want with these characters in the setting that's so like extremely original, way cooler than Zodiac. So in terms of Seven versus Zodiac, I have to say Seven, no contest, better than Zodiac. Again, that just kind of goes to show that like true crime is very boring compared to fictitious crime. You can invent a way cooler serial killer in your imagination than actual serial killers. Most serial killers are just fucking losers. Like, think fucking Jeffrey Dahmer, and then think fucking Leatherface. Who's fucking cooler? Who'd you rather watch a movie about? I don't really care about Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm not interested in exploitative rehash of his murders where he's played by fucking, was the guy from High School Musical, Zac Efron or whatever. No, he played Ted Bundy. But it's just like, why though, you know? Why go to the trouble of all this? I think Seven is great because not only is it a fantastic crime narrative, not only is it a great crime film with some great horror elements and thriller stuff tossed in there, and it's just a very thematically deep and complex movie, but it can be viewed on so many layers, and you can just peel them back for hours and hours at a time, which I've kind of done here. I mean, for less than an hour, but you get the point. It's the kind of film that you can just talk about, and it really doesn't get enough praise for that, because all that gets talked about is the ending, which, like, yeah, it's really good, but it's only good because of what preceded it. If it was just the ending, you wouldn't even know what was happening or who all these characters were. And I think Seven is much more impactful with the whole thing preceding it. And that just goes to show how good everything prior to the ending is. Like I said, I would argue that the best part of Seven, hands down, has to be the setting, the nondescript, generic, scrubbed, clean city. It's fantastic, and no other movie I know, I guess with the exception of Dark City, but obviously that's kind of an explicit reference to the city being generic, as opposed to Seven, where it's just kind of always in the background, and they make a point of it never to mention what city it is in the script or anywhere. But a casual viewer probably wouldn't even take any notice of that because it's done so well, it's done so masterfully. They keep the city hidden for thematic purposes, because what it's meant to point out is that America as a country, at least during the point where the film was made, and this was 1995, so it was obviously like pre-internet, or 1 year after the introduction of the World Wide Web, so the computers they use are very generic. Cops are playing poker on the top floor of the library. Morgan Freeman's character says, "Oh, don't you have any culture?" Because obviously he's trapped in the city, and the only culture he can get is from going to the library and escaping through books, and he has to be a very, cultured, educated type character with a lot of stock in literature and everything, because the city itself is just like so claustrophobic. The library actually feels in Seven like the only location that's like relaxing or just like pleasant, and the rest of everywhere just looks like total shit. I would say the strength of Seven is that thematically the city is absolutely like an effect on the characters, and it's done so well, it blends so well into the background, and you feel like, well, yeah, these characters are having a rough time of it, but if you're just watching casually, you won't even notice why they're having a rough time of it, really. You won't notice all the masterful decisions that David Fincher makes to make the city seem as oppressive and vicious and brutal as possible. Just an absolute horrible place to live that would produce people like John Doe or the people who he kills, because they're just miserable fucking people. Everyone in Seven is not having a good time. They're all having a bad day. Obviously, the generic quality of the city is designed to give some kind of statement about alienation, the loss of identity, homogeneity, the fact that, at least according to David Fincher, one would suppose you can move from one American city to another and notice very little difference. Personally, I don't really buy into that because I'm in Denver, and Denver isn't like any other city, at least from everything I can tell. It really can't be due to geographical limitations. It just isn't going to be like any other city because it's so far away from any other city. And as far as I'm aware, Seven isn't set in Denver, which is okay, because I don't think it looks too much like Denver. But what David Fincher is trying to say is more than that. It's not just that Seven could be in your city. It's that places like where Seven is set are losing themselves in an ever-growing and evolving and expanding world. Seven's place is so far removed from these machinations, and it's just like so abandoned and so like fucking rain-soaked and trenched, and everything is weird. It's all anachronistic. It's like Blade Runner in that aspect, really. Really, any neo-noir has to be. It has to combine the aspects of like classic noir, the ties and the suits and all that, with like being set in a modern time, which obviously is just going to lead to some anachronistic things by necessity. But I feel like David Fincher's Seven is probably the best movie set in just a nameless, dark void of hopeless despair. It's a really unique movie in that regard. Like I said, I don't know of too many other movies that are intentionally set in a nameless, generic city. Except Dark City, which I will get to sometime, I promise. So anyway, yeah, I guess that's all I really have to say about Seven. That its most prominent feature is its setting. Not even necessarily its characters. As great as the acting is, I have to say the most prominent aspect of Seven and the most like subconsciously impactful piece is the setting. So next time you watch Seven, just keep an eye out for every single time that like even a little bit of signage or advertising or anything comes up on screen in the movie, and you'll notice like how it's either blurred out, whooshed right past, or it's a manufactured prop that David Fincher created specifically so that the movie would be as generic and just like bland as possible. Not bland in terms of like storytelling, but just bland in terms of it depicts a really bland place that's like detached and sad. In that regard, it's a lot like Fight Club, being John Malkovich, The Matrix, obviously. A lot of these late 90s movies talk about, modernity, the end of modernity. Wow, we're so prosperous, but like the city is so fucking alienating. It's so weird, which is really cool. And I'd like to see that more in movies these days, but obviously they're more concerned with like the virtual as opposed to the physical. I gotta make a movie about Dark City. Dark City's a great fucking movie. Anyway, that's all I really have to say about Seven. What are your thoughts on Seven City? What are your thoughts on that David Fincher makes it so generic and nameless? I feel like that's an underappreciated decision that adds a lot to the film, and it should be praised more because it's really cool. It's a really neat filmmaking choice that really leaves me spellbound every time I watch it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's really fun to watch movies like this where you notice like little details in the background and stuff. Anyway, yeah, that's my video on Seven. Fascinating watch. I do recommend watching Seven. Damn good movie. I remember the first time I saw it, I was like 6 or something, watching it on VHS and seeing that opening credits with Kevin Spacey's fingers soaring through the fucking notebook and the Nine Inch Nails song. I didn't even know what Nine Inch Nails was, so that was like the scariest music I'd ever heard. That shit gave me nightmares. I didn't even have to watch the movie after that. I think I just turned it off after the opening credits. Those opening credits are pretty fucking freaky, and they deserve all the praise they've got. Yeah, that's my Seven video. I probably won't make another Seven video, but that's kind of my rundown, my thoughts on it. What do you think? Let me know. Alright, I've been Nick Cicada. From here to eternity. Yahoo!